Order County Council's meeting for Tuesday, December 7th, 2021. If we'll all please rise. Pledge allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We have a relatively small agenda for this afternoon. The first item on the agenda calls for a presentation of the fiscal year 2020 annual operating budget and capital spending program. And Mr. Howard Lazarus, our executive director, is going to conduct the presentation. Mr. Lazarus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we get started, I'd really like to express my appreciation to all of our directors, our budget staff, the treasurer, county staff, row officers, and the president judge for their help in putting together the county's budget for fiscal year 22. I think the budget documents are probably provide greater detail than anything the council's seen, certainly in recent history. Also with us today are some of our key staff who are here if you have any questions that drill into that level of detail, and also Mr. James Hayes, who will lead our efforts going into 2022 and hopefully will be at the podium next year speaking on behalf of the budget. So our purpose this afternoon is to provide a forum for public review of the proposed budget, to get feedback and then make adjustments to the financial plan prior to council taking action on the 15th of December to adopt the budget for next year. We did provide written responses to the questions that we received from council, and we've also detailed in that memo I sent some of the minor adjustments that were made. They were non-material, but they were just things that may be different than what you were looking at. So where are we in the process? You can see we're well into it. Today is the public hearing. Council, by charter, adopts the budget not less than 10 days prior to the new fiscal year. And then once we get council's, hopefully get council's approval on the 15th, we will have the budget loaded into our financial system. We will test it in plenty of time for the new fiscal year to begin. I will tell you that the detail we went into this year in preparing particularly the data volume has helped put us ahead of the game compared to last year. So hopefully that will be a stress-free operation. As a reminder to those who are watching, the budget is presented in 3 volumes. The first is the community guide to the budget, which gives you the financial plan by the numbers and shows how the resources that the public gives us are used to support our community's values and goals. The second volume is a detailed 5-year capital improvement plan, and for the first time provides descriptions of all projects and initiatives. And then volume 3 is data, and that gives a detailed backup for departmental budgets. And as I just mentioned, it facilitates loading of the budget into the financial system. The documents are available on the county's website at the link shown at the bottom of this slide. And we will, again, as we did last year, post the adopted budget as quickly as possible after council adopts it. The budget, as we're going to go through it, really consists of 4 parts. There's the operating budget, which is the general functioning of the county government. The capital budget is the 5-year CIP. The fiscal budget addresses the county social service agencies, which are approved on the state's fiscal year cycle, which is July through June. And then finally, we are including the Fair Acres budget separately, and that provides for the county's operation of its geriatric center. At your discretion, we can stop and receive input at the conclusion of each part of the presentation, or we can wait till the end. I'll follow your lead on that, whatever works best for you. This is the agenda for our discussion, provide a summary of each part. I did include a discussion, very brief, of the American Rescue Plan Act, because that does figure into the calculations for next year. And then we'll wrap up with some areas of concern, risk and risk mitigation strategies, and then with a wrap-up discussion about the budget as a whole. So just as an overview, the proposal meets council's direction of no increase in total expenditures and in fact decreases expenditures $3.5 million or 1.3%. When you add that to the previous year, council has bent the curve on budgeted spending, and we are getting closer and closer to having a structurally balanced budget. Capital budget expenditures are also decreased slightly, as are fair acres expenditures. Property tax rates are unchanged from last year. As I said, our goal is to get more revenue and cost realism. We are relying on $5.4 million from the reserves, which are for one-time cost, primarily for the transition and deprivatization of the prison. We put $1.7 million as a buffer there. And there are also the remainder of the funds that we set aside last year for technology improvements. So even though there is a reliance on the reserves, it's not to support ongoing costs. Our fiscal budgets do include almost $40 million in emergency rental assistance funding. Arpa funds are used to support the startup of the health department, provide for revenue losses, and there are some other allowable uses included as well. And then finally, the detailed presentation of the budget supports council's goals of greater transparency and accountability. So as an overview, these are the goals that we listed as a financial work plan last year. And there's a stoplight analysis there to show where we are on the progress of the things that we committed to do. Those that are leading, which are shown in green, are that we have departmental budgets that are shown with all of their expenses, and we have provided secure and automated access to financial data to all of the departments. We did continue to develop the CIP steering committee. We have added a technology component and also a transportation component to the CIP, and we did review future facility needs and configurations. At last week's council meeting, you received an overview of the facilities condition and needs assessment, and we will continue to integrate that into the CIP. We have provided for the health department and the deprivatization of the prison, and those will be two themes that pop up repeatedly throughout this discussion. The things in yellow are their tracking. We want to spend time over the next year, again, starting early in the year, to develop the tools that county leaders need to manage their budgets. We're going to start the process of integrating performance outcomes into the assignment of resources, and we're well on our way towards eliminating the large variances between budget and actuals for both revenues and costs. The areas that are lagging a bit are linking the financial systems to improve reporting and analysis, particularly for account balances. And we do want to implement quarterly reviews in the coming year and then start a comprehensive review, update, and upgrade of the county's financial policies. Getting into the budget, the operating budget, fair acres, and capital budgets do show a decrease from the previous year. The fiscal budget is primarily driven by $40 million in emergency rental assistance aid that is included in that 16.6% increase. So you can see that half of our budget is in human services and related fiscal budget activities. More than a third is in the operating budget, 6% is in the capital, and about 9% is fair acres. So what's new in 22? As I said, the startup and operation of the county health department, there's $11 million in the budget related to that, and that includes the benefits cost for the new staff we're engaging. Deprivatization of the George W. Hill Correctional Facility. We are looking at evaluation of community justice and rehabilitation initiatives. And in fact, there is a council liaison in the council budget this year. And we've also recently engaged the new director and superintendent of the Juvenile Detention Center. We created a sustainability unit to support the goal of sustainability and equity in all county operations. The details of projects and initiatives in the CIP are detailed with a page or so on each project. There is increased support of parks and open space. There's increased staffing in Mr. Manfree's department as well, including an assistant director. We have the opportunity to enhance our collaboration with local governments. Council had asked us to put in some liaisons to work with local governments, and they are in fact in the planning department. We've moved the GIS operation into the sustainability unit with the idea of having a combined GIS and data center so that we can use the information to make better decisions. We have separated housing and community development from planning so that it's a separate department, and that will fall underneath the community support services umbrella. And then we've incorporated the compensation study, pay scales, and cost of living increases. Non-union and union who are subject to or who are included in the compensation study or personnel plan will receive increases of up to 4%. There's 2% built into the compensation study, and then there's another 2% to make up for the high inflation this year. 3% really is what's incorporated into our union agreements, and right now we still have 9 union agreements outstanding. Some actions and requests that were received after this budget was submitted the last weekend in October. We did get questions from council and we provided responses to those. There are a couple of unfunded requests we got. One was from the sheriff for a new software system, one from the treasurer to provide additional staffing to look at evaluation of the valuations of property. A couple minor corrections in errata, either things that were, there were a couple minor errors as well as some things that we were asked to change the wording on. And then there's some work in progress. As I said, the health department, the prison, juvenile detention, those budgets were based upon the estimates that we had. The good news is that the contract costs we're getting for the prison are in line with what's in the budget. So I think that'll be well set. Health department, we still need to look as we hire health professionals what the actual cost of that is. Medical examiner's office, we made a lot of progress on this year, but there's still some work to do. On the election side, there's also some additional resources we need to look at to be responsive to some of the other needs. The good news with our election staff is that they conducted their required recounts accurately, quickly, and precisely. There is still information systems improvements we need to make. We're still working on the multi-factor authentication. There are some upgrades that we need to do, as well as some new initiatives that we're putting in place. And I said, as I just mentioned before, there are 9 collective bargaining agreements that are still outstanding. With that, you can pause if you have any questions on the overview.
Anything from council?
Okay. Well, then let's dive into the operating budget. The operating budget this year is $284 million and change, which is a 1.3% decrease from the previous year, about $3.5 million. You can see what stands out on this chart are the decreases in grants and reimbursements, other revenues, and reserves. So I'll go through those in a little bit of detail. The property tax increase is due to changes in valuation and collection percentage. We do have success at collecting north of 96% of the property taxes. Intergovernmental revenues rebound from the pandemic. Those are mostly court-related. Part of the increase, though, is due to the inclusion of Act 315 funds from the state for the health department. The fees and fines show an increase in collections from the Register of Wills, from the medical examiner's office, and court activities as we emerge from the impacts of the pandemic. The 19.45 in grants and reimbursements reflects the use of ARPA funds, 7.9 million of which is for the county health department. Other revenues include gaming, miscellaneous transfers, and other adjustments. The reduction of about 5.5 million is due to reductions in other transfers of 9 million versus an increase of 3.5 million in gaming revenues, both of which are reflective of the historic levels. When we looked at the revenues for this year, we went back several years at the historical levels because we're still operating in an environment where the pandemic has impact. So we went back to stable years to look and see what we actually wound up spending. The increase in reserves that's used are due to a one-time prison cost of 1.7 million that I just mentioned, the IT cost as well. So if you subtract those out, the remaining increase is 1.7 million, which is half of what we used last year to balance the operating budget. So we are making progress at balancing recurring revenues and recovering expenses. One additional thought is that this chart compiles the revenues by type. In Appendix A of the budget document, we've tracked revenues by department to allow for greater transparency in the actual cost of services to the county. Looking at the uses of funds, the largest uses are still in the community justice and court system areas. Community wellness is new. It reflects the addition of the health department along with the military and veterans affairs and one other unit. Sustainability, as I said, is new. And remember, with sustainability, most of the work that they do is through the capital improvement program. Employee benefits are reduced in the previous year; they're 13%. The reason for the large decrease in employee benefits, which I'll mention on a subsequent slide, is again tied to the use of historic actual rates as opposed to an estimate. The other thing to remember about employee benefits is that in the past, this is where the employee increases were during the budget discussion, and then they were applied to the different departments. This year, they're applied directly to the departments because it's not just a standard across the board increase. It's tied to the implementation of the personnel plan as well as the differing union agreement. So we did that ahead of time to make loading of the budget a little bit easier, but it also shows council a truer cost of what each department spends. Some significant changes. Administration shows an increase of about $2 million. Most of that is tied up with the information technology budget. The Controller's Office budget does increase to reflect the fact that additional staff is needed to support the addition of over 500 new staff members. The elections budget increased by about $0.3 million as well. The Controller's Office budget also includes staff needed to conduct internal audit functions, which is something that Ms. Phillips has been trying to get established for a while, and it's certainly worthy of your support. Community wellness, I talked about, was really the health department. And on sustainability, we've added that as a fund center, so we'll be able to track the monies that we spend on that. And then within that group, there are increased budget for parks and recreation, mostly tied to increase in staffing. The planning budget has increased as well. Public Works, we plan on increasing the staffing as well. And the facilities group has 2 additional craftsmen. So all that wrapped up together is about $1.2 million. On the employee benefit side, I mentioned that before. We budgeted based upon actuals for 2018, 2019. We adjusted it for inflation and the increased staffing and some of the savings from plan adjustments. Staff will not see any decreases in the level of benefits received. I think it's important to state that because as we get to more accuracy in our accounting for our expenditures, we need to let our staff know that the benefits programs are still there as they expect them. And then on the other cost, the decrease of about $3 million is really due to adjustments of transfers and allocations of reimbursable costs based on our actual experience. And that's a factor of many, many lines in the budget. So what does that all mean? If you look at the unrestricted general fund status, we started the year with about $77 million. And if you go through the projections for where we are at this point in the year, we're probably looking about a $26 million variance to the surplus side. We did use $1.5 million of fund balance last year. That shows a number of $102 million. The $71 million represents 25% of the budget in unassigned balance, something the bond rating agencies like to see. And in fact, it was one of the factors that led to the upgrade of our bond rating by Standard & Poor's. The GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, thank you, recommends that you have a minimum of 2 months, but you should adjust for your needs. So that really gets into why we are applying some of the available balance, the assigned under GASB 54. Each year, the controller asks for an assignment of the unassigned balance, and the $25 million really will be a risk fund and provide for some contingencies. Risk fund for employee benefits. We still have some uncertainties as to health department cost, and there's some other issues that we don't know how to address up front, particularly what inflation will look like in the coming year. So that's the reason for the recommendation of $25 million of assignments. It's also important for all of us to realize that we have yet in the past 2 years to have a normal year. We've been operating under COVID. Our revenues are still variable. Our expenses are also variable. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the budget, and the budget does represent a snapshot in time, and we need to be aware of what's coming that we don't know right now in the future. So that's an overview of the operating budget, and again, we can take a pause and address any questions or comments you may have at this point before we move to the CIP.
Anything from council?
I just have a question, and it may be really one of messaging. I am concerned that employees are going to see the decrease in benefits expenditures and not understand what the underlying reasons are for how that's shown in the budget. And as I understand it, there's really a variety of reasons. One is the raises weren't picked up in that budget line. Number two, there was that, as we have discussed at other meetings and in conversations I've had with you, Mr. Lazarus, that the budget for employee benefits always seemed to be high. I mean, this is not a recent phenomenon where we underspent what was budgeted. So in other words, the budget was not reflecting what we were actually spending. And there was a drill down and a real attempt based on what we've actually spent in the past, what our changes have been to get to the right number. And the last reason being that, of course, there have been some minor tweaks which have saved the county money, but will not impact the employee benefits available to employees. And I guess I would ask that there be some very deliberate messaging around that to explain it, because my concern is at a time when union contracts are being negotiated, when there was a discussion of changes, which we are now not implementing in the current year. And again, they wouldn't really have changed the benefits, although they would have shifted, the intention, I think, going forward is to really look at who pays for what. But I don't want people to see a big drop in the employee in what's budgeted and think that it corresponds to a drop in the benefits that are available to them.
Well, I appreciate that comment. We will make that communication and outreach.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Anything else from council?
Okay.
All right, bring back the screen.
Thank you. So as we move to the capital improvement plan, this is the area of the budget, as was mentioned earlier, where we've made a very large amount of improvement progress. The CIP is a short-range schedule of public improvement projects that the county government plans over a 5-year period. It details how we'll sustain and improve our infrastructure and our core assets. It identifies sources and uses of funds to protect those assets and eventually to replace them as they reach end of life. Capital assets are currently defined as a durable item with an expected life greater than 1 year and a cost in excess of $500. And I'll touch on that in a moment. The budget, as you can, is presented here. 2/3 of it is dedicated to facilities and buildings. As we remember from last week's discussion of the facilities condition and needs assessment, while many of the condition of many of our buildings is acceptable, if we don't make the investment in repair and replacement of components over the coming years, they will go into a more unsatisfactory state. There are also some compliance issues that we need to address. Parks, trails, and open space is the second largest component of the CIP, also reflected in the facilities condition and needs assessment. The transportation component was added primarily to reflect the payment that we make to SEPTA every year. That is a capital improvement. Information technology, we added as a new item within the CIP for the coming year. And then small capital purchases are those things that currently meet the requirement for classification as a capital asset, but fall beneath the code requirement for reporting as a specific project. So, and that really addresses the ongoing maintenance and repair of our facilities. And again, I'll address that in a moment as well. This year, we adopted a new prioritization methodology for the CIP. The CIP Working Group was established with representatives from around the county to solicit, receive, evaluate, and prioritize projects using subject matter experts from each area within the county. The prioritized listing was presented to the Capital Committee per the County Administrative Code. And then a project database has been developed that will be made available to the public via the county website. As I mentioned before, our bond rating was improved from AA to AA+, which over the long term will help decrease the cost of money when we go out to borrow funds for the CIP improvements. On the right, you can see from the volume 2, the different prioritization schemes that we used. The primary criteria with threshold requirements, that means we have to do it. It either addresses an unsafe condition or it addresses a compliance issue. And for the note at the bottom, 79% of the projects in the CIP meet the threshold requirements. There are things that we have to do. The secondary criteria after things were added because of compliance and safety are, do they protect an existing asset? Is there an advantage of doing the project from a timing standpoint with other projects? Does it advance one of the county's strategic goals or one of the sustainability goals? And finally, how much does it enhance the quality of, or community quality of life? So there's a structure here to how things now get entered into the system. And it is, again, it's transparent, it's equitable, and it's viewable by the public. This is a summary of the planned expenditures and also the new financings that we'll need. And you can see there is $150 million of new financing over the next 5 years, and I'll touch on that in a minute as well. The majority of work is facilities and buildings, as shown on the uses of funds. And then on the small capital purchases, that's an ongoing requirement as we need to fix day-to-day items in our buildings. So this chart is also in the CIP document. Okay. I included this chart that shows the impacts of us taking out the loans that are in the CIP program. The graph depicts on the red line the current debt, and in the green line the impact of the new debt. There is no impact on the fiscal year 2022 budget when we take debt out this year if council chooses to do so. And that's because in each of the years where we're taking down new debt, we've deferred the payments until the following fiscal year. It does peak out at just over $32 million in fiscal year 2027. But the reason for the decline generally is the retirement of debt related to both the landfill and the prison. And that's why the lines decrease towards the mid part of this decade. It does lead us to a discussion in the coming year of what should be the debt service on a sustained basis going into the future to sustain our capital assets. But the bottom line is that in 2022, if council chooses to take out the $35 million loan, there is no impact on the debt service in next year's budget. The CIP improvement process, we still need to fully integrate the facilities condition and needs assessment into CIP planning and execution. And then we need to go and reconcile the existing commitments with the adopted CIP. There are funds that are tied to projects that we may not do, so we need to see if we can unencumber those funds. We need to collaborate, and I've talked to Ms. Phillips about revising the definition of a capital asset, and she's strongly in support of it as well as we look at next year to match what's in the administrative code where a capital asset has a cost of $5,000. That will simplify the bookkeeping. It will, though, require an adjustment in the operating budget in facilities management to provide for small maintenance costs. And then finally, we want to improve reporting on the status of CIP projects. And while you can see on the insert to the right, each page of the, each project page in the CIP document does show which stage of advancement the project's in. And we need to pull that data out and provide better reporting, again, on a website that is viewable by our public. So, and that, again, pause if you have any questions about the CIP.
Anything from council?
You know, I guess it's just, again, more of a question. I am very appreciative of seeing the SEPTA funding broken out. And as SEPTA has discussed with all of council, you know, they're definitely going to be looking for more money coming from us at some point in time. I guess I'm not 100% clear on the decision to put it under the capital budget, in that it's not entirely clear to me that the municipal subsidy, that the county subsidies are 100% capital. And it is a reoccurring expense for us. So I was just wondering, had that been reviewed with the auditors? Is there, or is there a likelihood? I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's the money out the door, but perhaps the sources of funds are relevant for that.
We get, there are two components to the SEPTA ask every year. The $2 million plus for capital comes in a letter that requested for capital improvements. There's, I'm trying to remember the number, I think there's around $800,000 that comes out of the operating budget, and that's listed under other expenses, the other subsidies and grants line in the budget. So there are two parts, one is capital, one is operating.
Okay, so you're, when you talk about the subsidy being broken out, you're really talking only about the capital part.
Right, and it comes by separate letter. We get the two letters from SEPTA, and we get two bills every quarter from them.
Okay, I just wasn't clear that it was, I mean, I had seen that in the budget and I was happy to see it. I just wasn't clear that that was only the capital piece. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay.
Anything else?
Okay, so we'll go into the fiscal and grant funded budget. As I mentioned at the start, the fiscal and grant funded agencies comprise 50% of the county's expenditures, and to many people are the primary face of the county and our communities. The fiscal year 22 budget includes about $40 million in one-time emergency rental assistance funding under ARPA, and that is a separate line in ARPA from the aid to local government. So that doesn't impact the $110 million the county gets for aid to local governments. These agencies do operate on a July to June fiscal year, but they also incorporate funds from the federal fiscal years, which goes October through September. And then also there are some funds that come from the county, January through December. So Ms. Garrison and her staff are very adroit in managing the different colors of money and making sure we meet all of our reporting requirements, but it does make reporting on a single budget a little bit difficult. We would look at converting the health department to a July through June fiscal year after its startup, and it would be included under that group of health and human services for administrative support, because they all operate with a mixture of funds on a fiscal year. That'll also get us some certainty in the operating budget, because just as when Sandy has a requirement in the budget for local cost share, we know what that number is. When Fair Acres has support from the county, we know what that number is. And then going forward, we'll know what the number from the operating budget to the health department is with greater certainty. It's also important to note that Department of Human Services also supports services provided by community justice activities. And that is a big part of the rehabilitation aspect of our community corrections, our community justice. And then finally, the goal for fiscal year 22 is to develop performance outcomes and performance measurements, so we know what the benefit is that we get from using all these funds we get from other sources. When you look at human services, you can see there's a wide suite of services that we do provide to our community. It's a complex mix of uses and funding sources. The bottom line number here does reflect the $40 million in ERA funds. And if you have any questions, I will graciously pass those on to Ms. Garrison. Some other agencies that we haven't really reported on in the past, library services is 23% of other agency grant funding. That one little sliver of emergency medical services is Pat O'Connell's operation. And then Kate McGeever and workforce development is 76% of the other agency grant funding. So with that, we can pause for any questions you may have on the fiscal budget.
Anything from council?
Okay. So we can then look at Fair Acres. Fair Acres total budget does decrease by 1.3%, just around $1 million. And when you look at where it comes from, most of the reduction is due to reduction in the general fund subsidy, but that's offset by rent, sale, and others. It does include the potential sale of 100 beds at, is that 20, what's 100 times? I'm sorry?
For $2 million.
For $2 million. Total is $2 million. I don't do math well on the fly sometimes. The other thing that Mr. Travaglini asked me to mention is that although we've grouped Medicaid as an intergovernmental revenue, it's really not an intergovernmental revenue. It really stands on its own. But the budget is pretty stable from year to year. You can see where their expenditures go and where the increases and decreases are. Again, bottom line is that's a slight decrease. And then some of the significant factors in the Fair Acres budget. It does include the one-time revenue source of $2 million from the sale of 100 beds. Part of the draft Fair Acres business plan shows their census going from 874 to 567, and the chart there shows step by step how the reduction may occur depending upon decisions that are made. But the goal over the next couple of years with Fair Acres is to reach a stable operating level, again, to understand what the county subsidy is required to provide this as a safety net for our older residents. And then quickly, I'll go into the American Rescue Plan. The plan here is what we submitted with our first report this past August. The amounts that are assigned there are not permanent. They're written in sand, not concrete. Certainly as we get more feedback, more input, and we react to the situation as the pandemic is still with us, we can expect that council will change those assignments. In the fiscal year 2022 budget, we are using $19.45 million. As I said before, 7.9 of that is for the health department. $1 million is in the DA's budget, combined DA and CID budget for the gun violence prevention program. We have addressed an extra $2.5 million for COVID response costs. And when we put that in there, I don't think we realized that we'd be dealing with additional variants of COVID, but it does provide for the fact that we're going to have to do additional vaccinations. We have to do booster shots. So it shows some prudence in setting aside reserves. The $8 million in allowable revenue loss really is what amounts to the still structural difference in the budget. That's where we need to balance both sources and uses after we take out some of the differences and changes in the budget. So I'll move then into, are there any questions on either Fair Acres or Arpa Funds? If not, I can move into
I actually did have a question or two.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
So in terms of the Fair Acres plan, you had mentioned that there was a like a future plan. Is there some sort of strategic plan that Fair Acres is working on or that they have available for council?
And Bill can, Mr. D'Amico can address it a little bit more, but they do have a draft that shows what they think they can sustain over the future. And then there is a financial component that comes with that as well. And did you want to address that?
Sure. The primary goal is to, our primary goal is the right size Fair Acres, as you saw in the presentation. We want to get to the number where we think we can sustain a census at. The census has been fluctuating downward throughout the industry for the past 3 years, and then with the pandemic, it hit really hard, so we couldn't get a true number. We believe that between that 567 and 600 is our real number, and then we are adjusting our operating costs for that. We have held off on some hirings throughout the past year, and we'll be reallocating those positions based on need. Also, we are looking at alternate uses for our buildings. As you see, there are some rentals, but we did close some buildings and consolidate some of our uses to our resident care buildings, and now those buildings are being looked at for alternate uses and possible rental incomes and shared services income, where we would be providing services to those buildings.
Thank you. And I know that Councilwoman Ruther has been working on, has mentioned a few times some sort of strategic plan, and you possibly coming to present to council about what kind of the overall plan is for the next few years and then also into the future. Have you contracted with a group to work on a strategic plan, or are you doing that in-house? Or?
We've been working on it in-house.
Okay, and what would be the timeline on having that strategic plan available?
We could probably meet you in the first quarter after the first of the year, if that's possible.
Yes, no, that
Okay.
sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question as well, not about fair acres. This is more of a process question than a substance question, and it's about the ARPA funds. So we've allocated 19.5 of those funds in our operational budget. As we move forward in 2022, we're bound to make decisions about how we're spending some of that money. Some of it will be outside of our operational budget. It'll be, to Commerce Center or to particular programs. But some of it will affect our operational budget. So for instance, we may decide that we want to spend more than $7 million of that money in our health department, or that given some new variant, we need more than 2.5 for COVID response. When that happens, is that, or if that happens, would that cause us to amend the budget, or how does that work process-wise? How do we make this, we know that's probably going to happen. There'll be some variance in the way we are thinking about spending the ARPA dollars.
Councilmember, if those decisions are for projects that are outside of the operating budget, then you'll need to approve the expenditure of those funds, and we'll set up the accounting for it. If there's something that occurs within the operating budget, then we'll have to come back and ask for you to amend that. Our goal, though, is not to use non-recurring funds to spend on recurring requirements. So in the next couple of years, as we drill down, there's no doubt that the $8 million you're using this year helps fill a hole. We need to fill that hole without one-time monies in the future, and we'll get that, I think, through being more accurate in our budgeting. So if things come up that will benefit the community that council determines is a good use of these funds, if it's not in the operating budget, it depends on how we spend it, but if it goes into an operating department, we've been accounting for that funding separately in the system. We can continue to do that with your authorization to use those funds.
Okay, thank you.
So just to quickly follow up on that, it sounds like if the item is changing the budget, and I'm going to just pick a real life example. I mean, we've been approached about putting additional money aside for childcare due to the ongoing impact of the pandemic. Right. And the thought is that this would be supplemental to anything that we already have in our budget or anything that might come down in the future through federal legislation. But it's still an expenditure related to the pandemic, and it's happening as likely a grant. That would be an expenditure where we would approve the expenditure, the grant, if that's what we were doing, like as we did before, and we would do it through we approve the expenditure and the source of funds. Right. But if we were to say, we feel like it's, and I'm totally making this up, so there's been no discussion, but if we were to say there was a project that IT would take on. That would be an additional project, and it wouldn't be a software acquisition or implementation, but it would be some kind of systems maintenance type stuff that we're asking them to take on, or institute some sort of employee training on an ongoing basis, clearly operating. Then we would be doing a budget amendment.
I think that's a good comparison, and I'll start with the CARES Act funding. With the CARES Act funding, most of that, a large portion of that was used to offset staff costs for allowable activities. And in the system, we showed that as a transfer into the budget for those operating departments. That kept them from blowing through their budget, but it also kind of skewed the results that we saw. With the ARPA funds, those are carried separately. If the projects don't impact the operating activities, as you said, of the department, then we're carrying that separately. But if it does, then we need to move the funds into the budget and amend the budget. I think what we're doing now gives greater clarity on the operating side, because we'll be able to see, what staff is doing that is directly related to COVID, and those things that are projects where we're providing money to community-based organizations are separate from the approved budget. So I think your analogies and the examples you used illustrate the point very well.
But the key is that, I think one thing that I just want to emphasize, my understanding of how we're budgeting this year is that we're asking people to budget based on what they actually expect to spend, and that it's not just carrying over numbers from prior years, which means that in certain departments, numbers, well, it's not, 100% zero-based budgeting. We've asked people to sort of test their numbers against what they've spent and try to, I'd say, winnow out of the budget those items that have been kind of accidental reserves or contingencies within a department. So now if somebody is going to take something on going forward, that's an expansion of their operational activities. And it could be for all kinds of good reasons in connection with our prison, returning to public management, with respect to healthcare, with possibly yet more election law changes. I mean, we don't know what it will be, but all the work we're going to have to do with a new park and the planning for that and maintenance of it, we could find ourselves needing to go back to our reserve more frequently than in the past, because there aren't sort of built-in, what I'll call built-in contingency dollars. It is inadvertent or not necessarily identified that way.
If you'll forgive me for going down a rabbit hole a little bit, just provide some detail. The biggest variance in the budget every year is that we budget for positions assuming every position is filled come January 1st. And we have vacancies that come up throughout the year. So the biggest variance you see in the operating lines is in staffing. So that's one big issue where some of the funding is what contributes to the difference. Another is that we get reimbursed for the support that we provide to the fiscal agencies into the operating budget. That doesn't usually occur until close of the books, so somehow that's built into the budget as well, and we need to take credit for what we know we're going to get. That'll bring the operating deficit down as well. And in this year's budget, there is $11 million that's new in health spending that we didn't spend in the past. I'm not blaming the health spending for it. It's something that's of value. We need to do it, but we need to adjust over the coming years to get that into our operating budget. So that's, I think, the good thing that we did this past year by drilling down, looking back all the way in some cases to 2014, is that we've identified more of the true cost of operating the county budget. And we can identify and reduce the number of degrees of freedom that are there and understand where the differences are, because there's an opportunity cost when we over budget, when we put cushion in it, was the word you used. And if we can get our hands on that going forward, we'll have a better feel for what our actual revenues are, what our actual costs are, and it'll give us a more accurate budget. And then if we do need to draw into the reserves, it will be done in a wholly transparent and accountable way, because we'll have to come back to council and say, we didn't budget this, this is why, and then we can have a real public discussion about why we need to adjust the budget.
Yeah, so I guess that's true. I mean, this gives council a little bit more control, but I guess my point is that given the desire to budget based on what we think people are actually going to spend, we create a situation where if there are contingencies where additional operating expenditures are required, we can expect to have to go back to the unassigned fund balance.
I agree, yes.
Yeah, I would push back on that just a little bit. I know you and I spoke about this, Howard, about how historically we have only spent about 90% of what we actually budget. I think that was the figure you gave me.
Yep.
Which is why in the 6 budgets I've looked at, 5 out of the 6, we had a significant surplus, sometimes on the tunes of $10 to $20 million. I do not want people who are listening or watching this to think that we went through a zero budgeting process this year. I know that word was just used. That is a long process, which I hope we will eventually get to, but that is a very heavy lift. It means basically breaking down to zero everybody's budget and building up then. Tell me exactly how you're going to spend every dollar. And we have not had the time or resources to ever do that in Delaware County. So I don't think it is a fair expectation that we will need to go into the unassigned fund balance with this year's budget going forward. Of course, things happen, right? That's why you have a rainy day fund, because unforeseen things happen. But I guess I want to push back a little bit about the what I thought I heard was an expectation that we might need to do so.
I just want to be clear. I think I explicitly said we did not go through the exercise of zero-based budgeting, but there was an attempt to ask people to base their budgets on what they have actually spent in the past and not what the prior budget number was. I just wanted to be clear.
What we haven't done, really, our biggest cost is personnel-related cost. That's true of any governmental entity. If we were to have a true zero-based budgeting approach, we would be able to assign what everybody does to a particular line in the budget and understand what their activities are. And we want to get closer to that in the coming year. So staffing needs to be related to performance outcomes, and then you can assign the level of effort to that. We did not do that. We did scrub the other expenses, though. So we looked at that part of the budget based on contracts that would be awarded. And one of the things, just as an aside, that we should do in the coming year is we should start to pre-encumber funds as soon as we know we have that requirement, so we don't count monies twice. Because if we look at the financial system, we see monies available, we may not be remembering that we had a planned use for that. So that's a discipline that we need to put into our accounting process starting with the 1st of January. However, from a staffing standpoint, we do need to go back and look at what everyone does, what their role is, and then build up from zero, because one of the biggest variances, as I said, in the budget year to year is in the personnel line, because we have positions that we don't fill with bodies. And if you remember last year, that was probably the biggest bone of contention as we started to cut out positions and we found that there weren't any dollars associated with those. So that's the one area that we really do need to address. So I think it's a bit of a hybrid approach that we use, but I think you're correct that we started the process. Mr. Zidek is correct that it's not a true zero-based budget yet.
I wanted to clarify one other thing that Ms. Schaefer, I think, touched upon. That so when I looked at the Health Department economic impact, that was a fairly detailed document that set forth a budget for the Health Department over the next, I don't remember how many years, but certainly more than 3.
Right.
And I think it provided for $10.5 million of expenditures in 2022, and it provided different revenue lines. So there would be a revenue line for Medicare, Medicaid, insurance, and client fees was one of the revenue lines. State revenue was another revenue line, and those were lagging, right? So the Medicaid fees, we're not going to start getting those, or much of them, January 1st of 2022 in the way that we might get January of 2024.
Sorry.
Ms. Schaefer touched upon the use of ARPA monies, and that would be a permissible use of ARPA funds would be to support our health department. And it couldn't be a lot clearer that a health department is aligned with funds to deal with the COVID crisis. So if we were to find that, in fact, instead of costing 10,
need to be modernized, because some of those are not capable of the hardware is not capable of being upgraded in the software to accept things like multi-factor authentication. Our communications are hampered by the fact that we have 5 county domains, and we have to figure out how to bridge that so that something as simple as the executive director's update, something like the sharing the benefits pamphlets, are things, even accessing the intranet are difficult because people are on different domains. We do want to move to cloud hosting of our applications, which will improve our security as well. So those are things that I mentioned in the document that are areas of concern that we will have to look at what resources are required. When we look at risks and uncertainties, we talked a lot, even this afternoon, about revenue and cost realism in budgeting. When you look at a $300 million operating budget, if everybody comes in at 90%, that's still $30 million difference that we could be using for other things. On the revenue side, we're much closer to our estimates, but there's still a bit of uncertainty, particularly when we look at fees for services and other sources of funds. We had the conversation just now about transitioning to both a performance-based budget and a zero-based budget in 2023. With Mr. Hayes' feet now firmly on the ground or getting there with adding the staff that we need, I think we'll be able to get there. And the benefit of that is that directors and their staff will be even more aware of what's in their budget. And we do need to eliminate our reliance on reserves and coronavirus relief funding to balance the budget. On the impacts of inflation and built-in cost increases, Mr. Hackett in the Treasurer's Office has talked about improving the reporting of real property value additions. We need to grow the tax base through economic development and invest in our commerce center. We have to look at our facilities. Do we need all the space that we have? And in talking to Mr. D'Amico, maybe we move out of rented space where we're putting the money in the hands of a private property owner, and we support him in his maintenance needs for the infrastructure that are currently part of the Fair Acres campus. We've had a lot of discussions about addressing cost and structured benefits plans, and we have started down the road of greater staff participation, and we need to provide for a risk fund because something may happen. And it's not prudent for us to build cushion into the budget for the one thing that may occur where we can put it aside in a risk fund if it does occur. And then the cost of the deprivatization, the juvenile detention center, Delaware County Health Department. I talked before also about the medical examiner's office, our RT cost. We need to provide contingencies somewhere in the budget. And we need to address how and why persons are incarcerated, how they access services throughout the county. And so we need to transition ARPA funds for the health department to other sources. We need to do a better job of working with our state and federal delegations and representation firms to find other sources of funds. We've been successful with the RACP funds. We need to look at other sources as well. Community partnerships are an area where we could do better, as well as partnerships with other local governments, maybe in shared services or shared resources. And then finally, the point I want to leave with is we need to measure and monitor outcomes of our programs for effectiveness. It's one thing to spend money we have, it's another to understand if it's achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve. It's one thing to give inoculations to kids, it's another to see if we actually reduce childhood disease. And then what are the things that contribute to the 20-year difference in life expectancy between different parts of the county? That's when we get to that stage, we'll know we have an effective performance-based and zero-based budget, and that's what we're going to strive for in the coming year. So with that, I want to thank you very much for really the great input in the discussion we've had, and open it up to any other kind of questions and discussion that you would want to have.
Thank you, Mr. Lazarus. Appreciate the presentation. The next item on the agenda calls for council's questions of Mr. Lazarus. I know we posed some of them, but perhaps council has others. All right, if there's nothing else from council then, I would open this up for public comment. If anybody from the public who is here wishes to address council, feel free to do so. Come to the microphone, please give your name and address, and we'd be pleased to hear your comments.
Zerdy Adobe, 200 Powhatan Avenue in Leicester, Tinicum Township. Chairman Zidek, members of the County Council and County Budget. On issues that I raise from year to year, which is the airport issue, is my main issue with how the agreement in 2015 was structured. So just to reference that, last year I asked you about the status of the fixed guaranteed payment for the 2021 budget. And you said that it was in the budget for 2021 at some location under revenues, but there's no specific line item for that. Now, in your budget this year, under the one that you have for 2021, on page 6, I believe it is, of the data tables.
Sorry, this is in the 2020.
Pardon?
This is in the proposed.
The data tables, yes. You list under the intergovernmental revenues, the Philadelphia non-department revenue, Philadelphia International, and I'm guessing it's obviously the fixed guarantee payment. And you have actuals for 2018, 19, and 20, and then budgeted for 2021 is 0. And then for this 2022, you have $604,444. So whatever happened to that money in 2021, I know that it was distributed by the city of Philadelphia for payment for that tax guaranteed according to our township budget. So that's one issue that needs to be looked at to find out whether that money's missing. In fact, if it is, there needs to be an investigation as to where that money is, and or if it was just that you just didn't include it in the budget for some reason, but no reason was given in the 2021 budget. And again, just for this purpose here, this governmental, this payment, I again protest you're receiving excess monies for the distribution of that money. The Interborough School Board has raised our taxes every single year since that agreement and the payments were made. And you have received more than $2 million excess money, as well as the township. And you should adjust that according to the millage rate, which makes much more alleviate at least some of the tax burden in the Interborough School District taxpayer. Now on this, on some of the things that Mr. Lazarus brought up during his presentation, compared to the 2021 budget that you made. On Appendix B, which is expenditures for 2021, you have listed under the expenditures on 2019 actuals. You have listed for debt at $29,433,965. And in your 2022 budget data table, you have that figure noted. But the one right below it in the 2021 budget says $39,995,477 for 2019 actuals. And then in your 2022 actuals, it reads $36,798,567. Now, if the actuals change from year to year, you need an explanation as to why they are changing. Because actuals, but just by definition, mean that They're actually what the money that you actually spent, right? Wouldn't that make sense? Okay, so I would ask that you find out just exactly why the difference is on actuals from year to year. Under the this current, you have the definitions or you have listings for the revenue on your general revenue data tables. And in the presentation by Mr. Lazarus, he listed total general fund as $284,561,413. But in your data table, it lists the total general fund as $269,863,394. So just for clarity's sake, wouldn't it be better if you had consistency in describing the different things that you're proposing? Because the total operating revenues, which is listed under there, is $284,561,413. But your budget for expenditures is $353,454,849. Now, I'm sure that the difference there is other things that you've added, but there's nothing in here that indicates that kind of additional table to explain that. So those are things that I'd like you to address before you pass the budget at the next budget meeting.
I appreciate that, and
Thank you.
appreciate your attention to the subject. I'm not privy to having the 2021 budget in front of me, and so it's tough for me to on the fly compare. Can I ask you to send an email that would outline these discrepancies?
I don't have email.
Okay. Can I ask you to send a note to us that would describe these discrepancies so that we can make sure that we are looking at them? I'm afraid I didn't catch all of that, and so I guess I could try to look at it through the videotape and make sure that I caught it all. But if you could provide something in writing to me that outlines these discrepancies, that would assist us in addressing this.
I'll drop something off to you.
All right. Thank you. Any other comments from the public? All right. We'll move for council remarks. Any remarks from council?
Well, I do have some general remarks that I would just like to note how far we've come. So, when we came in two years ago, I guess now, one of the commitments we made was to have a budget, a line item budget, detailed line item budget on the web, available to everybody while we were discussing it, not after the fact. And we have achieved that. And I want to give a great thanks to Howard Lazarus and to pretty much every department head who participated in this. We were very short-staffed in the last 6 months when we were putting this together, and I know everyone worked very hard to make sure that we could deliver what this council demanded, which was a line item budget, detailed line item budget with actuals going back 4 or 5 years, which has never been presented. On top of that, a capital improvement budget going forward 5 years, which residents of this county have never seen. So I want to just take a moment to applaud, that achievement in an environment where we were so short-staffed, and I can't express my gratitude loudly enough. Of course, there are still things that we need to work on to make it perfect, and a lot of them were identified by Mr. Lazarus. I think that we should head for our fiscal code and for our Fair Acres budget, fiscal budget and Fair Acres budget. I'd love to see us head in that direction for those two budgets as well. Line item online for everybody to see while we're discussing them. And I know we will end up there. I mean, that's where I'm going to leave my comments for now. I am really, really pleased with how far we have come, and I really appreciate the colossal amount of work that went into it.
I would like to echo Ms. Schaefer's appreciation for the effort that went into this and to, address council's requests for more detailed reporting. And I think, I don't think, it is my hope that what we're working with now will give us a base for more monthly and quarterly reporting to council that will allow us to understand where we are against budget, and will give us and the public, who would be able to see those reports that would be presented at public meetings, the opportunity to see why there might be a budget amendment. In this last year, when we made the budget amendments, they were for really big things. They were for major IT projects associated with the health department and bringing back the prison. And they were money set aside for the prison transition in the health department. There were some changes, I think, involving elections. And they were pretty self-explanatory. I think it's, on a going forward basis, I expect there will be even more transparency, and that people who want to go back and trace why we arrive at decisions to make changes that we are, or why we might say no to certain proposals based on the budget, people will be able to follow that logic by following the reporting. And, that's where we want to be. Where people understand, may or may not agree with the decisions, but understand why they're being made. And I am particularly grateful for the fact that we do seem, in this time of tremendous uncertainty, we're meeting the rating agency's expectations about having money set aside. I realize that it may seem like we're flush. My view is we really aren't. We are trying to be more realistic about what we're spending, and that the monies that are set aside may very well be needed, because we just don't know what's coming down the pike. The health department, for me, is a big unknown. The prison is a big unknown. It wouldn't surprise me to see that in connection with bringing the prison back, we find that there is something we didn't know we needed to deal with that's going to require a substantial expenditure. And the other thing that, we've talked a lot about, one of our biggest variables is the staffing costs. And that's because positions are open that then need to be filled. And I think it's really important that when we think about one of the uncertainties that we're looking at in the next year, the continuing impact of the pandemic and the lasting impact that the pandemic has had on how people approach their jobs, whether they're willing to work two jobs. We are seeing sizable increases in hiring costs. I can tell you most of the people that we've hired for senior management positions, certainly we've hired at well above what we thought we were going to be hiring them at. Not all of them, but many of them. And I think we have lots of openings in highly skilled areas like IT, and it's not going to be cheap to hire those people. The same is true for, the health department. And we've also got a number of union contracts that are being renegotiated in a world that's really different than the world was even 6 months ago. So these are the uncertainties that I see. These are the reasons why I'm grateful for the additional clarity that we have in how our budget is presented. And this is the reason I am glad we have a sizable unassigned fund balance to work with as we move forward into 2022.
Yeah, I'd first like to, again, echo the thanks. We see this end result this time of year, but there obviously has been an extraordinary amount of work that's gone on throughout the year. So my great thanks to all the budget directors, to Mr. Lazarus, and to everyone who's brought us to where we are today. And to Ms. Schaefer's remarks, I mean, it really, at least in terms of weight, I mean, this thing weighs about 100 times more than the 15-page PDF that we were handed 3 years ago. So it really has, been a great stride we've taken. As I look at the budget, I think, largely we have a balanced budget. It is not, there may be a marginal, surplus, there may be a marginal deficit, but it's reasonably balanced. Where my eyes really turn to is to page 17 of Mr. Lazarus's presentation, which is the general fund balance and where we're sitting at today. And I want to really be clear what we're talking about. When we say we have $102,525,000 that we anticipate as our general unassigned fund balance, that is $102 million of taxpayer money that's sitting in a bank account not yielding any money, essentially not yielding any money. And I think we have to really, and I may be stating the obvious, I don't want to disparage my fellow council members because they know this as well as I do, but we are the stewards for the taxpayer. The taxpayer and the voter puts in us a level of responsibility that we will be acting in their best interest as to what to do with their money. And that's what it is. It's not our money, it's the taxpayers' money. I absolutely agree that we live in, different times. There is always uncertainty. But the easiest thing in the world for us to do is to say, the world's uncertain. We need to keep every single dollar that we have in this bank account because we're going to need it all. It's going to all be, something that we, there's too much uncertainty in the world. Let's keep it all. But I would argue that that is a decision. I think we have this inherent bias toward doing what we've always done. It's just a human bias. We go to the same grocery store we went to last week. But when we do the same thing that we've been doing, that in and of itself is a choice. We could choose to raise taxes. Maybe 100 million isn't enough. Maybe 120 million is enough. We could choose to cut taxes and go down to 80 million. But each of those are inherently three different decisions. But we have a bias toward just sticking with where we are. That is, I think this idea that we should just do nothing, we should keep where we are, that is very much and absolutely as much a decision as either of the other two. So, I think when I look at 102 million, just to put in perspective, the county has never had that much money in the unassigned fund balance. Only a few years back, we were in the $60 million range. This is an extraordinarily large number for us to be sitting on. And I don't fully get why we think that is the right amount. I see the breakdown that Mr. Lazarus has put. I see this, 25% of budget is $71 million. That is a sort of rule of thumb. But I really want to understand exactly why we think that is the right rule of thumb, because it's a lot of money that's sitting there. And, if it really is, if we're going to look at this, rating agency, the ratings of AA+ versus AA, is that how important is that? It sounds nice. It sounds great. What is it actually in terms of value to the county? Because this is a mathematical equation. We can look at it and say, what is our yield going to be differently if we are at AA versus AA+? Is it 50 basis points? That's actually probably a pretty conservative number. It's probably less than 50 basis points, but let's just assume it is. Let's say it's 50 basis points different in terms of our cost of borrowing. And we're talking about borrowing $35 million over the next few years. You apply 50 basis points to 35 million, and you're only talking about $175,000 a year. And so if we're going to be holding in our pockets $25 million of taxpayer money in order to save $175,000 a year, you're talking about a yield of less than 1%. If I'm, hiring a financial advisor to decide what to do with my money, and they're telling me that they're making a decision that's going to yield less than 1%, I'm going to fire that financial advisor. So I think we really have to think about what we're talking about here. $100 million is a lot. And I would ask my council members to think about, do we really need all of that? I would argue that we don't. I think something in the range of a $20 to $25 million one-time adjustment, and whether that be in the form of a rebate or call it what you will, but something that, gives back to the taxpayer at a time when they're facing the same sort of uncertainties that we are, we put it back in their pocket. To me, that is the most responsible thing we can do as stewards of taxpayer money, is to give the money back to the ratepayer in this form, while still maintaining a neutral budget, this being a one-time thing, but one that I think is the most responsible thing that we can do.
I definitely want to react to that, but I yield to those who haven't spoken yet. So put me in line.
Yes. So first, I would like to start by echoing my colleagues' thanks to all the individuals who've been involved in this effort in putting the budget together. This has been a work in progress over the last 2 years, and really trying to get to a more transparent position with our budget. So I commend those who worked on the CIP and getting that to the point that it is, because there's so much more information available to the public and to council as to where we're going with our CIP, along with adding in all those grant-funded programs to this year's budget and making those more available. And so I guess I understand your sentiment and where we are. And for my position, we have several pieces of this budget that, although we have it together in a budget to present, they're in flux. And we actually don't know what the impact of all of the entities in our current budget are going to be over the next year or two. And we have been in flux. And to say that, that's always what it's like, this is not what it's always like. Because I'm pretty sure that there was a council that maybe you sat on that actually gave back a refund a few years back. So it's not that there are groups that always do things. Oh, it wasn't yours? Okay. And so that's not something you can't say that this is something we're always doing the exact same thing. I think in the last 2 years, we have been in a constant stage of, we actually don't know what is happening and what is going to happen next. And hopefully COVID is behind us and we can actually move forward. But as we move forward, we still have departments and groups within the county that we have a lot of change to. We're adding in new additions, our criminal justice reform groups, our new department that's with the DA, these parts that are ARPA funded that are going to need to be brought in to the county budget over time. These are all pieces of the puzzle that we don't have a full handle on quite yet. And I am not opposed to giving back to our taxpayers. I'm just not positive that this is the right time. I don't think that we have enough working knowledge on our budget and where we are right now to understand what the impact is going to be over the next year or two. I do believe that we will have a better handle on it, especially on the health department and the prison, and what that impact will look like over the next year. But I just don't know if we're there yet, because we haven't experienced either one of those pieces.
Thank you. I guess for my part, I'm much more prone to offering criticism than I am praise. So this isn't perhaps my wheelhouse here, but I will offer praise for the budget that was presented. It is often said that a budget is representative of the values of the government that passes that budget. And one of our values that I think we have demonstrated throughout the past 2 years is one of transparency. This budget presentation is a literal physical representation of our desire to be more transparent. You may like it, you may dislike what the conclusions are, but by any measure, interested taxpayers are better able to understand how their taxpayers are being spent with this budget than they were with last year's budget, and certainly than they were with the budget in 2014. And so I would thank Mr. Lazarus for all his hard work on this. I know we had outside consultants that were also helping. Their name escapes me right now, but this is some of the fruit of that labor, and people complain about this council hiring outside consultants. This budget would not have been possible without the assistance of an outside consultant, and I think it makes us a better government. It's my belief, and I've stated this consistently since I ran for office in 2017, that our taxes are too high in Delaware County. And to be sure, most of the responsibility for these high taxes lies with our school districts, who raise the vast majority of our property tax revenue. I can't do anything about school tax rates, but I can do something about county tax rates. So I wanted to put some of these things into context. In 2021, each Delaware County resident paid about $305 in county property taxes. To put that in context, in Montgomery County, each resident paid about $267 in county property taxes. As Mr. Madden, and Mr. Madden stole a lot of my thunder, as I've experienced over the past 4 years. But these are difficult times, not just for the county, not just uncertain times for the county, but uncertain times for all of the residents of Delaware County. COVID wrought havoc on many household budgets. Lots of waiters and waitresses couldn't work. Some people left the workforce entirely out of fear for their own health, or because they faced difficulty in providing daycare when schools closed. In making 2021 and 2022 even more difficult for at least some residents is the fact that the court-ordered reassessment resulted in many residential residents paying more in property taxes in 2022. I believe we can offer some measure of relief to our county taxpayers, and we can do it in a responsible manner. The proposed budget anticipates leaving a fund balance of $97 million. And I think of the fund balance as like a rainy day fund. The proposed fund balance contemplates holding money equal to 34.2% of our budgeted expenditures in case of rain. Again, to put that in context, Montco proposes to hold 17.65% of their expenditures in their fund balance, Chester County 17.55% of their fund balance, and Bucks County 9.66% in their fund balance. We'll put an asterisk next to Bucks County. Their expenditures aren't actually matched up in an easy way to match to ours, so it's likely more than 9.66, but probably more along the lines of what Montco and Chesco are doing. The highest fund balance I could find in the region was Lancaster County, that held a fund balance of 20.7% of their expenditures. We don't need a fund balance of $97 million. I propose that we either reduce our taxes or we provide a tax refund to our residents, and perhaps we do both. If we had a fund balance that was equal to that held by Montgomery County and Chester County, our fund balance would be about $50 million rather than $97 million. By that measure, we're holding almost $47 million extra. I think we could afford a tax cut and/or a tax refund. Even if you support Mr. Lazarus's much more conservative view that we should have a fund balance equal to 25% of our budgeted expenditures, we'd still have $26 million extra in the kitty to support a tax cut and/or rebate. The Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, and the National Association of Counties, NACO, explain that counties should have a fund balance of at least 2 months of expenditures. That equals 16.47%. Using that metric, our fund balance should be at least $47 million. That's significantly higher than it was when I came into office, as Mr. Madden alluded to. It was around $24 million at that time. And this figure would be consistent with Montgomery County's goal of having a fund balance of 15% to 20% of their expenditures. The proposed budget, our proposed budget, contemplates a fund balance that is almost double what NACO and the GFOA recommend. I think this offers further support that we can afford to use some of our excessive fund balance to support a modest tax cut and/or tax refund. And incidentally, I think we should also adopt a fund balance policy to guide our thinking on this subject going forward. I know Montgomery County has such a policy. We don't have one that's stated anywhere that I'm aware of. As further support for the wisdom of using an excessive fund balance to pay for county expenditures rather than taxes, we can look to our neighbors once again. Our budget already contemplates spending $5.39 million of our fund balance to support our expenditures. We can afford more. Montco plans to spend about $12 million of their fund balance rather than relying on taxes in 2022. Chester County appears likely to spend over $20 million of their fund balance to support their expenditures. And Bucks County intends to spend over $18 million to support their budget. And remember, all three of these counties have fund balances that are smaller than our fund balances. From my perspective, it is government's role to ask taxpayers for money when we need it to spend on things to support our taxpayers. We don't need this much in taxes, and we shouldn't ask our taxpayers to pay more. I hear that we live in uncertain times. There has never been a time in my life that I haven't heard that. Every single year of my 52 years of existence, people have always said, in times like these, or these are uncertain times, it's always uncertain times. We never know what next year is going to bring. We're not going to know next year when we're sitting here, when you guys are sitting here doing this budget, you're not going to know what the next year is going to bring. That's always going to be the case. The last thing I'll mention two other things. We're not even talking about the extra money we have in this ARPA kitty. And the ARPA kitty, the money from the Arpa Funds, to be clear, isn't as fungible as this money. There are constraints upon it. but it is still there, and we shouldn't ignore its existence. If the health department does cost us more than we think, we have ARPA monies that can be used to support that. The last thing I'll say is that one of the reasons, an additional reason that I think that the money should be given back is that it's been my experience in this world that if government has money, it will spend it. And I think if we keep extra money in the government coffers, it won't go to taxpayers. It will be spent. So I hope that, as Mr. Madden said, we can work together to figure out what an appropriate amount is to give back to our taxpayers of this excessive fund balance. Thank you.
May I just have a couple minutes to address?
I think Ms. Schaefer might have been first in queue.
Oh,
If you
I'm
wanna
sorry.
start.
I'm sorry. I defer.
Probably have a lot of similar thoughts, but I will start. First, I want to react to what we actually have that is accessible to us. It is about $1 million in our fund balance now. The number 25% of what we need to set aside, that is a GFOA recommendation. That is best practices. That is best practices. Minimum is 2 months, and that's why most people have 2 months. And if you look at any government that is AAA, many governments that are AAA rated, they adhere to the 25%. And that's what most governments strive to achieve. It's very difficult to do. And the fact that we do have that right now is probably very largely responsible for our upgrade in our rating. So if you look at, if we want to achieve best practices, which I would submit most of us do, that is a 25% set aside. That is what best practices highly recommended. So I, for one, would like to achieve that. That still does leave a lot of money on the table. That's still 25, maybe 30 million left that is unassigned. And I totally agree. If we were if next year and the year after continue to see that type of surplus, you're right, we're overtaxing. And we don't need to bring in all that revenue. We can give back. However, we are in a period right now that it's not just uncertainty. We are in the midst of a massive transformation and rebuilding of a government. We have change in so many areas, in so many departments, with so many unknowns right now. And I would like to just take the time to inventory some of them because it's staggering what we are looking at in terms of change, transformation, and uncertainty in our obligations over the next year. First, the health department. I don't need to go into that. We've covered it. You know, the uncertainties of what may come up in terms of the expenses that are associated with that. With our jail, again, we are taking on an entire county jail system. We think we've planned it out very carefully. We think we've conservatively budgeted. We don't know for sure because we haven't done, we don't know exactly what we'll be facing. Our medical examiners department, we're going from a 2, 3, 4 person, very understaffed, very underfunded, and we are seeking to build a top of the line best practices medical examiners. Those costs, again, uncertain because it hasn't happened yet. Elections, we have had to spend a lot of unanticipated dollars in the last 2 years adhering to the new election laws. We have no idea how those laws are going to continue to change. They will continue to change. If you pick up the paper any day, there are fights about what's going to happen, about how our elections are administered. We know for sure there will be change. We just don't know what they're going to be and how much they're going to cost us. We have made an increased commitment to open space and spending on open space. We have no idea what opportunities are going to come up in front of us in the next 5 years, let alone the next year. We have made an increased commitment to investing in economic development. Again, we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like. We're in the middle of a strategic planning process. Hopefully in the next few months, we'll have a much better idea. But right now, as we pass this budget, we don't have certainty. IT, we have decades of deferred costs an expense need in our IT systems, decades. And that is going to cost a lot of money. Again, we've made some conservative estimates about what that's going to cost. We don't know for sure. It's uncertain. Our facilities. Just a week ago, we heard from a consultant who told us we need, I think he said 200,000 square feet more of space than we already have. And they identified millions of dollars each year over and above what is in our current CIP that we need to invest in our spaces to keep them up to par. Again, uncertain. We didn't know that. It's not in our budget right now. I have more, but I'll stop here. I think I've made the point. We are in a very transformational period right now. And COVID. I forgot to mention COVID. That is another uncertain area. We are not out of this pandemic. We do not know what variants are coming our way. And it may be that we need significant more money to invest in that. So I think that, yes, we do have a comfortable surplus right now. We also have unprecedented uncertainty. And I think it would be very ill-advised. In fact, I think it would be irresponsible for us to spend that money for kind of the short-term gratification of giving money back to our taxpayers because we have extra right now, when it may be that that would cause us to be in 2-3 years' time, we would have to raise taxes because of all of these unanticipated or uncertain expenses that we have in front of us. Finally, I want to say once again, if we continue on this pattern of having that type of surplus every year, I absolutely would reconsider the rate that we're taxing our residents or a rebate. But this coming off a period where we have had $200 million pumped into our budget, that's not lasting. That's like a one-time thing. Yeah, so of course we look flush because we got this big influx of money, but that's not lasting, and we can't budget and we can't scale back because of it. Because in the long term, we will suffer and we'll end up in a position where we're short.
Ms. Ruther.
Thank you. Fortunately for everybody, Ms. Schaefer covered some of what I would have said, so I don't have to repeat it. I just do want to point out that I think budget policies regarding the extent of an unassigned fund balance and reserve, they're a very good thing. And they are a thing that is warranted when there is a well-established budgeting process that people are comfortable with and have a lot of faith in. Where particularly when you're operating at what I would say is sort of the status quo. Mr. Zidek did look at our neighbors and what they're doing. And I would point out that it's been well over a decade since Montgomery County went through a transition that's comparable to what we're going through. And I would say that partly given the makeup and the very professional nature that Chester County's financial systems have had, I don't think that even with a transition in control, which was historic in their county, just as it was in ours, that they have seen the same kinds of shifts. I don't believe either one of them in recent times has gone through the sort of personnel changes or the kind of radical transformation that we're going on into by adding a health department, which is the first new health department in the state of Pennsylvania since, is it the early 1990s?
1989.
1989. And so it's really uncharted territory because people don't really know how much it's going to cost. Similarly, taking back a prison, we have every reason to believe that over time, this is going to be a positive, not just for our criminal justice process and for turning around, really trying to change the way that we deal with offenders, but it's also going to be an improvement fiscally for Delaware County. The problem is in the short term, we don't know that. We don't know what kind of effort we're going to have to go through as we approach the transition date, whether extra resources, yet more consultants might need to be hired to make sure that every IT system that needs to be up and running is up and running, to make sure that every facilities change that needs to be made is made. And we will do those things, and we will have the money to do those things. The part that I think Ms. Schaefer really covered was the need to invest. And she listed a lot of things that we need to invest in. And I would point out that prior councils in Delaware County did not invest. It's why a building fell down. It is why our IT is not where it needs to be. It is why probably our most valuable asset, our people, our staff, isn't where it needs to be in terms of numbers, in terms of salaries, in terms of training and opportunities to progress. It was, I think, at best, a form of neglect to invest. And we are having to deal with making up shortfalls in all of those areas at a very uncertain time. But it is something that I think we have to do to really be able to serve the citizens of Delaware County the way they deserve to be served. And I would point out that when we came into office, I speak for myself, Ms. Schaefer, and Dr. Taylor, because Mr. Zidek and Mr. Madden, had been here fighting the good fight in the minority. We were offered a $3 million unassigned fund balance. $3 million. The county county council elected to spend down an unassigned fund balance by, something in the neighborhood of $23 million rather than raise taxes. And Mr. Zidek, I think, was proven right that there was a lot of fluff in their budgeting. And, it's what I've called the cushion that was built into all of these small reserves and contingencies where people never adjusted their budget line items to reflect what they were actually spending. But at the same time, it was terrifying when we came in. And we found out, I found out specifically that, in elections, for example, 50% of their positions were vacant. No planning had been done for vote by mail. We had to completely reconstruct that department. We spent millions of dollars. We've tripled the budget, tripled the staff, and we're probably still not done, because that's what it takes to make sure that we can run an election and deliver for people in Delaware County. And we had no flexibility to do that under the budget. And I sit here and I very much appreciate the fact that I would not have wished this pandemic on anybody, but the CARES funding that came in in certain respects was a lifeline for some of the monies that we needed to spend. And it helped us. The CARES funding did, because nobody should have to face that sort of uncertainty. Now, I know that is not what either Mr. Madden or Mr. Zidek are proposing. So please, they're not proposing to not raise taxes by eating into our unassigned fund balance. And I do appreciate that, but I share Ms. Schaefer's view that we do not have the kind of established fiscal discipline and confidence in all of our processes for me to feel comfortable reducing what I admit is a large fund balance, but I don't have the confidence I need. And I know there are numerous times, and Mr. Zidek's aware of them too, where I have been far more cautious than he has. And sometimes I'm happy to say I've been proven wrong, and sometimes I haven't. But we each have to make our individual decision up here. I will be very happy if after 2 years of working with Mr. Hayes and his team and going forward and continuing to build what I think are going to be state-of-the-art budgeting practices that allow us to truly understand what it costs to run this government as we want to run it, not as it's been run in the past, but as we want to run it in the future. We will be in a position to decide if we can reduce taxes or, and I will tell you, I'm always in favor of reducing taxes. I think the idea of doing a rebate is fraught, and not the least of which somebody's got to sit down and figure out who's getting how much money, where that money is going, issue the checks. That is not a small undertaking. And my thought would be, if we do find ourselves, in a couple of years getting to a point where we recognize that we've been fiscally conservative, we don't need to be, then I would very happily do whatever I could to reduce our tax rate. But I am not there this year, and it is my judgment, and I will be here next year, and I will be here the year after that. After that, it's up to the voters. But for the next 2 years, I've got to figure out how comfortable I can get reducing our tax rate further, and I'm not there this year, although I certainly appreciate where both Mr. Zidek and Mr. Madden are coming from.
Yeah, just a couple brief things in response to the remarks of my colleagues. One, just on one of the latter points that Ms. Schaefer made, I want to be clear about what I'm proposing. I'm not suggesting that we create some wildly difficult administrative process to send checks back to taxpayers and amounts to be decided. I'm really, I think whatever would be done, I would, insist that it be done in a way that's easy on our team. And to the very most simple way, it might just be as simple as cutting taxes this year with an explicit statement along with it that tax rate will spring back to where it was in 2024, absent some, 2023, absent some other action by council. That would be the simplest way of doing it, right? But hopefully there might be something that, delineates the rebate or refund or whatever you want to call it in a more explicit way. I think, I heard a few times this sort of idea of best practices, particularly Ms. Schaefer was speaking about that. This 25% number, if we're going to cite it, I think we really need to be clear about where it comes from, because to be clear, it's not what our neighboring counties are doing. As Mr. Zidek pointed out, Chester County, Montgomery County are more in the 17% range, and yet their ratings, are higher. And I realize that part of that is because they have, higher per capita, in terms of their real estate values. But nevertheless, if we're just going to throw out best practice, I think we have to be really clear about what we're citing when we say that. And I'd also say, again, saying we're AAA, which we're not, by the way, we're AA plus, but AA plus versus what we were when we were sitting at a 20 million, 30 million fund balance of, AA. Again, we have to really be clear about what is the value there. It shouldn't just be, a positive point on the PR scale. It's like, what is the value? And the value really is your cost of borrowing. The incremental difference for one rating agency, because we were already there on Moody's and it was just a change by S&P, there is no way that our borrowing costs are more than 50 basis points difference between the two. And that's really the only value that there is there. It's not, I know we love to say we're best practice, but what is that value? We have to really look, if we're going to be the responsible financial stewards, we have to look at what that value is, because there's a cost to it. $25 million is a significant cost to sort of be sitting in the kitty. I think the last thing I just wanted to say is, again, I'm not diminishing the fact that we live in uncertain times. As Mr. Zidek said, we always live in uncertain times, but we are double counting. The fact that we have ARPA funds in another balance that can be utilized for many of the things we're talking about. If the health department, startup costs end up being a bit more, we can still tap into ARPA funds beyond what we currently have. Same for the jail, same for, other of these things that are sort of upfront transitional costs. If they end up being more, there are a significant amount of ARPA funds that are there on top of what we have in the remaining rainy day account that would still be there. This, $75 million would still be there. That's what this is there for. And lastly, and I think I already said lastly, but I apologize about that. We can raise more money. I think if the idea here is, well, let's just not borrow going forward. Again, the financially responsible thing for a tax-exempt entity like ourselves to do is to raise debt capital. Our cost of borrowing is substantially less than me wearing my, taxpayer hat that I can borrow at. I can't borrow on a tax-exempt basis. And so, we can still raise what I think we had in our presentation today of another $35 million and probably more, and still be within a responsible amount of borrowing for an entity like ourselves at a very low interest rate. And given how low interest rates are, that is the responsible thing to do. So we have a number of mechanisms to really pull into for these, this always list that we will have of the uncertainties of the future. So again, I'm not expecting that we will have consensus here today, but I would at least ask that my colleagues give some consideration to what we talked about today and consider if there is some amount of money that we can put back into the taxpayer's pocket and still feel that we are standing on very conservative grounds in doing so.
Just for my point, I guess I'll make a couple quick points. I will point out that both Montgomery County and Chester County are AAA rated, and they're holding 17.5% in their fund. We don't need 34.2% in our fund to get a AAA rating. Mr. Madden touched on this, but just to be a little more explicit, one of the things that I think Ms. Schaefer and Ms. Ruther talked about was the need to make investment, to perhaps invest in open space and to invest in our buildings. And I don't disagree, and I have been a proponent of that consistently. Those are not expenses to be borne out of an operating budget. As Mr. Madden is alluding to, those are capital expenses. We shouldn't ask today's taxpayer to bear the entire brunt to buy an asset that's going to be enjoyed for generations. That's why you take out debt and you have that paid off over time, so that people who are enjoying it are paying for it. So the last thing I'll say is, I made the comment that I fear that if government holds on to the money, it will spend it. And I fear that Ms. Schaefer's laundry list was supportive of that. We will find a way to spend the money. If you have extra money sitting around, I won't go on beyond that. But the last thing I'll say is that it was mentioned that it's irresponsible, perhaps, for us to provide a tax cut. If we were to provide a 2.5% tax cut, which is what was done 2 years ago, that's $4.3 million. We have $45 million extra. 4.35 million. If you were to do a 5% tax cut, you're talking about $8 million. Given the sums of money that we have sitting around, these are drops in the bucket. I don't think it is responsible for us to keep money hidden in the cushion of the counties when our taxpayers are in need of it. That doesn't feel right to me. So, I hope, as Mr. Madden said, I hope that in the ensuing week we'll be able to come to some sort of agreement about finding common ground here and finding the best path forward. I know that we all have the same desire before us, which is to do right by the citizens of Delaware County. So, usually when people have the same desires, they're able to come to some sort of compromise, and I hope we will be able to do so here. There's no other comments then. I think I've lost my agenda, but I think that's the last item on the agenda.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you. We'll let Bishop on my 1 hour.